My name is Beverly Christine Matthews, and I'm 53 years old. 3 nights ago, I was in my garage with a flashlight, staring at something that made my blood run cold. There, hidden under my car like a venomous spider, was a small black GPS tracker that my own son had placed there. Just hours earlier, Derek had told me he'd checked my brakes for safety, but what I discovered was far more sinister than a routine inspection. The brake line had been deliberately loosened, designed to fail during highway driving. As I held that tracker in my trembling hands, my phone rang with news that would change everything forever. Before I dive into this story that nearly cost me my life, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories of survival and betrayal. Trust me, you won't believe how deep this family conspiracy went, so stick around because what happened next will shock you to your core. Let me take you back to how this nightmare began, because the signs were there all along, hidden behind the facade of a caring family. I've lived in Portland, Oregon for over 25 years, building a successful career as a real estate agent specializing in historic properties. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. 2 years ago, my husband Richard passed away from what the doctors ruled as a sudden heart attack. At 51, I found myself a widow, grieving but determined to rebuild my life on my own terms. The inheritance Richard left me was substantial. Beyond our family home, I owned my late mother's Victorian mansion in the historic Alameda district, appraised at $2.8 million. There were also investment properties, retirement accounts, and a life insurance policy that left me financially secure. I thought this security would bring peace, but instead, it painted a target on my back that I was too trusting to see. My son Derek is 28 years old, a mechanic who runs his own auto repair shop downtown. After his divorce from Stephanie last year, he'd been struggling both emotionally and financially. The divorce settlement had been brutal, leaving him with significant debt and a business that was barely staying afloat. I'd helped him through the worst of it, lending him money for legal fees and even co-signing the lease on his garage space. Looking back, every act of maternal generosity was being carefully catalogued by people who saw me as nothing more than a bank account. What made the betrayal so devastating was how normal everything seemed on the surface. Derek would visit twice a week, supposedly to check on me and help with household repairs. His ex-wife Stephanie had been surprisingly supportive during Richard's death and the aftermath, often bringing groceries or simply sitting with me when grief felt overwhelming. I was touched by her continued presence in our family, thinking it showed maturity and genuine care for our relationship beyond her marriage to Derek. My sister-in-law Janet, Richard's younger sister, had also become a constant presence in my life. She'd moved to Portland from Sacramento 6 months after Richard's funeral, claiming she wanted to be closer to family during this difficult time. Janet was always full of concern about my well-being, constantly suggesting I was taking on too much, pushing myself too hard, or making decisions without thinking them through clearly. At the time, I interpreted her worry as love. But there were incidents that should have raised red flags. My morning coffee had begun tasting oddly bitter, even when I used the same brand I'd enjoyed for years. After family dinners at my house, I'd often feel dizzy or disoriented, symptoms I attributed to the stress of hosting and my ongoing grief. Important documents started disappearing from my home office, things like property deeds and insurance papers, only to turn up days later in different locations. Janet would always be the one to find them, usually with a comment about how I needed to be more organized or perhaps consider hiring someone to help manage my affairs. The most disturbing incidents involved my memory. Family members began pointing out conversations I supposedly had but couldn't remember, plans I'd allegedly made but had no recollection of making. Derek would arrive at my house claiming I'd called him about problems with the plumbing or electrical work, but I had no memory of making such calls. Stephanie would reference shopping trips we'd supposedly planned together, then act hurt when I seemed confused about the details. I began to doubt myself, wondering if grief was affecting my mind more severely than I'd realized. The thought terrified me, especially after watching my mother struggle with early-onset dementia before her death. I made an appointment with my doctor, Dr. Elizabeth Warren, who ran comprehensive tests including cognitive assessments. Everything came back normal, but the nagging doubt remained because my family's concerned comments continued. The financial irregularities started small. Derek had been added to my checking account as an emergency contact after Richard's death, something that seemed prudent at the time. I began noticing small withdrawals, $20 or $30 at a time, usually on days when Derek claimed he'd stopped by to check on the house while I was at work. When I asked about them, he'd explain them as reimbursements for groceries he'd picked up for me or small household items he'd purchased. The amounts were so minor that questioning them seemed petty, especially when Derek was struggling financially and I was grateful for his help. Janet had been spending increasing amounts of time researching elder care options and legal protections for aging adults, topics that seemed premature since I was only 53 and in excellent health. She'd leave pamphlets about assisted living communities on my kitchen counter or bookmark articles about estate planning on my laptop. When I questioned her focus on these topics, she'd claim she was simply being proactive and looking out for my future well-being. The surveillance began so subtly that I almost missed it entirely. Janet would know details about my daily routine that I hadn't shared with her, like which grocery store I'd visited or what time I'd returned home from work. Derek would reference conversations I'd had with neighbors or mention appointments I'd attended, information I hadn't given him. They explained their knowledge as coincidental encounters around town or casual mentions I'd supposedly made but forgotten. Looking back, I can see how methodically they built their case that I was becoming unreliable, forgetful, and potentially incapable of managing my own affairs. Every seed of doubt they planted was carefully cultivated, every concerned comment designed to erode my confidence in my own mental acuity. They were preparing for something much bigger than simple financial exploitation, but I was too trusting to see the full picture until that night in the garage when everything crystallized into terrifying clarity. The evening that changed everything started like any other Tuesday. Derek had called around 6 o'clock, saying he wanted to stop by and check my brake pads since I'd mentioned a slight squeaking noise during our last conversation. I didn't remember mentioning any brake problems, but lately, my memory seemed unreliable, so I agreed to let him take a look. He arrived around 7:30 with his toolkit, spending about 45 minutes under the car while I prepared dinner. When Derek finished, he emerged from the garage covered in grease and wearing what I now recognize was a guilty expression. He explained that my brake pads were wearing thin and the brake fluid was low, problems he'd addressed temporarily but warned needed professional attention within the next few days. His nervousness seemed excessive for such a routine maintenance issue, but I thanked him for his help and invited him to stay for dinner. He declined, claiming he had an early morning appointment, and left quickly after washing his hands. Something about his behavior nagged at me throughout the evening. Derek was usually comfortable in my home, often staying for hours to chat or watch television together. His hasty departure felt wrong, as did his reluctance to make eye contact when explaining the brake problems. After 30 years of motherhood, I developed a strong instinct for when my son wasn't telling the truth, and every maternal alarm bell was ringing. Around 11 o'clock, I decided to take a flashlight into the garage and examine his work myself. I'm not a mechanic, but Richard had taught me basic car maintenance over the years, enough to identify obvious problems or poor workmanship. What I found under my sedan made my heart stop beating for several seconds. The brake line had been deliberately loosened, not enough to cause immediate failure but sufficient to create a catastrophic accident during highway driving when the brakes would be under maximum stress. But the brake tampering wasn't the worst discovery. While examining the undercarriage with my flashlight, I spotted something that didn't belong there. A small black device about the size of a matchbox, attached to the frame with heavy-duty magnetic strips. Even without technical knowledge, I recognized it as a GPS tracking device. My own family had been monitoring my every movement, and my son had just sabotaged my car in a way designed to kill me. My hands shook so violently that I nearly dropped the flashlight as I carefully removed the tracker from its hiding place. The device was sophisticated, clearly expensive, and had obviously been there for weeks or possibly months based on the dust accumulation around its edges. Everything clicked into place with sickening clarity. How Janet always knew my whereabouts, how Derek could reference appointments and activities I hadn't shared with him, how they seemed to anticipate my schedule better than I did myself. I didn't confront Derek immediately. Some survival instinct told me to gather evidence before revealing what I knew. I photographed the loosened brake line from multiple angles, documenting the deliberate nature of the sabotage. The tracker went into a small box in my bedroom, hidden but preserved as proof of their surveillance. I spent the rest of the night researching GPS tracking devices online, learning how they worked and how long they could operate before needing replacement. The next morning, Derek called to check on me, asking if I'd noticed any changes in the car's performance. His voice carried a tension that confirmed my worst fears. He was waiting for news of my accident, probably expecting a call from the hospital or police. Instead, I told him the car felt fine and I was planning to drive to my therapy appointment that afternoon, the same route I took every Wednesday along the winding highway that connected Portland to Dr. Patricia Morrison's office in the suburbs. When Derek arrived at my house 30 minutes later, claiming he'd forgotten his socket wrench in my garage, I knew he was actually checking to see if I'd discovered his sabotage. I watched from the kitchen window as he spent several minutes under the car, probably tightening the brake line to eliminate evidence of tampering. He emerged looking confused and agitated, glancing repeatedly toward the house as if wondering whether I'd seen something I shouldn't have. Our conversation that afternoon was the most terrifying 20 minutes of my life. When I confronted Derek about the brake tampering and tracker, his initial denial was immediate and vehement. He accused me of paranoia, suggesting that grief was affecting my judgment and making me suspicious of people who loved me. But as I described exactly what I'd found and where, his composure cracked completely. Derek broke down into tears, admitting that he'd been monitoring my movements but claiming it was for my own protection. According to his tearful confession, the family had become genuinely worried about my mental state, particularly after incidents where I'd seemed confused or forgetful. Janet had convinced him that I was planning dangerous solo trips to remote areas, possibly with suicidal intentions, and that surveillance was necessary to keep me safe. The brake sabotage, Derek insisted, was an accident. He claimed he'd been checking the brake system and had loosened the line to examine it but forgotten to tighten it properly afterward. His mechanical training made this explanation implausible, but he stuck to the story even when I pointed out the deliberate nature of the loosening pattern. Throughout his confession, Derek kept begging me not to tell anyone about the tracking device, claiming that Janet had threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent if I didn't cooperate with the family's safety measures. What chilled me most about Derek's breakdown wasn't his admission of surveillance, but his genuine belief that he was protecting me from myself. He'd been thoroughly manipulated into thinking I was mentally unstable and potentially dangerous to myself. Janet had convinced him that drastic measures were necessary to prevent me from hurting myself or others. In his mind, he wasn't betraying his mother but saving her from her own deteriorating mental state. I agreed to keep quiet about the discovery while I figured out what to do next, but Derek's behavior after our conversation told me the situation was far more serious than he'd admitted. He made 3 phone calls from my driveway before leaving, conversations that were clearly urgent and distressing. Through my front window, I could see him gesturing wildly and repeatedly glancing back at my house. Someone was giving him instructions, probably Janet, and those instructions involved accelerating whatever plan they'd been developing. That evening, I called my brother Frank in Seattle, hoping to confide in someone outside the immediate situation. But Frank's first words were about his concern for my mental health, referencing a conversation with Janet about my recent episodes and concerning behavior. Janet had been systematically contacting my support network, painting me as mentally unstable and preparing them to support intervention measures. I realized that isolation was a key component of their strategy and that I had fewer allies than I'd believed. The most horrifying realization came when I understood the timeline they'd been working with. The brake sabotage wasn't random, it was specifically designed to cause an accident on my weekly drive to therapy, a route that included several dangerous curves and steep grades. Derek knew my schedule, knew exactly when and where I'd be most vulnerable to a mechanical failure. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity, but a carefully planned murder disguised as an unfortunate accident. The sleepless night following my confrontation with Derek gave me time to think clearly about everything that had happened over the past year. I realized that my family's sudden concern for my well-being had coincided perfectly with the probate resolution of Richard's estate, when the full extent of my inheritance became legally finalized. This timing couldn't be coincidental, and I began to suspect that my value to them was purely financial. I spent the next morning reviewing my bank statements for the past 6 months, searching for patterns I'd previously missed. The small withdrawals Derek had been making were more frequent and systematic than I'd realized, totaling nearly $3,000 over the past 4 months. More disturbing were electronic transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, authorized using Derek's emergency access to my checking account. Each transfer was just under the amount that would trigger automatic bank notifications, suggesting someone with detailed knowledge of banking security protocols. My home office had been compromised more extensively than I'd initially understood. Important documents weren't just going missing temporarily, they were being photographed or copied before being returned to different locations. Someone had been systematically documenting my financial holdings, insurance policies, and legal arrangements. When I found my will in Janet's coat pocket one afternoon, I knew the invasion of my privacy had been thorough and ongoing. The psychological manipulation had been even more sophisticated than the financial surveillance. I began keeping a journal of every incident where family members claimed I'd forgotten conversations or made plans I couldn't remember. The pattern was clear. These memory lapses always involved financial decisions, legal arrangements, or communications with people outside the family circle. They were creating a documented trail of apparent mental incompetence that would support legal proceedings to declare me unfit to manage my own affairs. Janet's research into conservatorship laws hadn't been academic curiosity but practical preparation. I discovered bookmarked websites on her laptop about the legal process for having someone declared mentally incapacitated, requirements for psychiatric evaluations, and rights of court-appointed guardians. She'd been in contact with 2 different attorneys specializing in elder law, presenting herself as a concerned family member worried about a relative's declining mental capacity. The most chilling discovery came when I found a detailed timeline hidden in Janet's bedroom dresser during one of her grocery shopping trips. The document outlined a 6-month plan beginning with establishing my mental incompetence, moving through conservatorship proceedings, and ending with my accidental death after the legal arrangements were finalized. Derek would inherit as my sole heir, with Janet serving as his advisor and receiving a substantial percentage of the estate for her family support services. Derek's financial situation was even more desperate than he'd admitted. His garage faced 3 lawsuits from customers whose cars had been damaged by incompetent repairs, with total liability exceeding $200,000. His business license was under review by the state regulatory board, and closure seemed inevitable within the next few months. The desperation in his voice during our confrontation made more sense when I understood how completely his livelihood was threatened. Stephanie's involvement became clear when I discovered her detailed reports about my daily activities, mood changes, and conversations hidden in Derek's toolbox. She'd been acting as a spy, documenting everything that could be interpreted as evidence of mental decline or instability. Her continued presence in my life after the divorce hadn't been motivated by affection but by the promise of financial compensation for intelligence gathering. The tracking device had been active for almost 4 months, long enough to establish detailed patterns of my movements and identify vulnerabilities in my routine. My weekly therapy appointments represented the perfect opportunity for a staged accident because the route was predictable, isolated, and included several locations where mechanical failure could easily result in a fatal crash. They'd been studying my habits like predators planning the perfect ambush. 3 hours after I'd found the tracker, my phone rang with news that made my blood freeze. My neighbor, Maria Rodriguez, had been killed in a car accident on Highway 26, the exact route I took to my therapy appointments. Her brakes had failed on the steep descent near Cooper Mountain, sending her car through the guardrail into a ravine 50 feet below. The investigating officer mentioned that Maria had borrowed an unusual route that day due to construction on her normal path home from work, a route that happened to be identical to my weekly drive to Dr. Morrison's office. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Maria drove a similar sedan, lived 3 houses down from me, and had been following my exact route at the time when my brakes should have failed. Someone had mistaken her for me in the distance, or the brake sabotage had been so expertly planned that it affected any car using that particular stretch of highway. Either way, Maria Rodriguez had died in the accident intended for me, and her death was my responsibility even though I'd been the intended target. Frank called that evening, having been contacted by Janet with updates about my deteriorating condition. She'd told him about my paranoid accusations against Derek and my delusional beliefs about family members plotting against me. Janet was preemptively discrediting my version of events by framing them as symptoms of mental illness. When I tried to explain what I'd discovered, Frank's responses made it clear that Janet's campaign had been effective. He genuinely believed I was experiencing psychological problems and needed professional intervention. The sophistication of their plan was terrifying. They'd created multiple layers of documentation supporting my incompetence, established legal groundwork for taking control of my affairs, and developed a method for eliminating me that would appear completely accidental. Maria Rodriguez's death proved they were willing to accept collateral damage to achieve their goals, and her accident would probably be investigated as a random mechanical failure rather than deliberate sabotage. I realized I was completely alone in understanding the truth about my family's intentions. Everyone in my support network had been poisoned against me through Janet's careful manipulation. Derek genuinely believed he was helping rather than harming me, making him even more dangerous because his actions were motivated by twisted love rather than simple greed. The next phase of their plan would begin soon, probably within days, and I needed to find help from someone outside their sphere of influence before they succeeded in destroying me completely. The escalation began the very next morning when Janet arrived at my house with an unexpected visitor. Dr. Raymond Ashworth introduced himself as a psychiatrist specializing in age-related cognitive decline and family intervention services. Janet's explanation for his presence seemed reasonable on the surface. She'd been concerned about my recent behavior and had asked a professional friend for advice about how the family could best support me during this difficult period. Dr. Ashworth was in his early 60s, distinguished-looking, and spoke with the kind of authoritative tone that made questioning his expertise seem disrespectful. He explained that Janet had described several incidents that suggested I might be experiencing early-stage dementia or stress-related cognitive impairment. His visit, he assured me, was completely informal, simply an opportunity to chat with someone who specialized in helping families navigate these challenging situations. What followed was a carefully disguised competency evaluation conducted in my own living room. Dr. Ashworth asked seemingly casual questions about my daily routine, recent memory, and decision-making processes. He inquired about my financial management, asking specific questions about recent purchases, account balances, and investment decisions that I had no obligation to answer but felt pressured to address. Throughout the conversation, Janet nodded sympathetically and added details about incidents that supposedly demonstrated my confusion or poor judgment. I played along while secretly recording the entire encounter on my phone, letting Dr. Ashworth believe he was conducting a successful informal assessment. His questions revealed extensive knowledge about my personal life and financial situation, information that could only have come from Janet's detailed briefings. When he asked about my relationship with Derek and recent family tensions, it became clear that my confrontation with my son had been reported and analyzed as evidence of paranoid thinking. Dr. Ashworth's conclusions were delivered with professional sympathy but unmistakable authority. He suggested that I was experiencing significant stress-related cognitive changes that were affecting my judgment and perception of reality. The brake incident with Derek, according to his analysis, was probably a misunderstanding exaggerated by my heightened anxiety and suspicion. He recommended immediate evaluation at a specialized facility where comprehensive testing could determine the extent of my cognitive impairment and appropriate treatment options. The trap was sprung perfectly. If I agreed to the evaluation, I'd be entering a controlled environment where the assessment results could be manipulated to support their incompetency claims. If I refused, my refusal would be interpreted as further evidence of impaired judgment and resistance to necessary medical care. Dr. Ashworth mentioned that family members had legal options for ensuring that loved ones received needed care, even when those individuals were unable to recognize their own limitations. Derek arrived while Dr. Ashworth was still present, carrying a manila folder containing documents that he claimed were routine insurance paperwork requiring my signature. His timing was obviously coordinated with the psychiatric evaluation, creating additional pressure for me to comply with their recommendations while demonstrating my family's ongoing concern for my welfare. The papers, Drive. Ashworth noted approvingly, showed how responsibly my son was helping manage practical matters that might be overwhelming for someone in my condition. I recognized the documents as legal papers that would transfer power of attorney to Janet, effectively giving her control over my financial and medical decisions. The language was complex and deliberately misleading, designed to appear like standard insurance forms while actually signing away my legal autonomy. When I refused to sign without reviewing the documents with my own attorney, Derek's reaction was immediate and telling. His facade of concern cracked, revealing genuine anger that I wasn't cooperating with their carefully orchestrated plan. The confrontation that followed was brutal in its psychological sophistication. Dr. Ashworth explained that my refusal to sign important insurance documents demonstrated exactly the kind of impaired judgment that concerned my family. Janet tearfully described her fear that I would make catastrophic financial decisions or endanger myself through poor planning. Derek added details about my paranoid accusations, and claimed that I'd been making threatening statements about family members who were only trying to help me. When I attempted to defend myself by explaining what I'd discovered about the tracking device and brake tampering, their responses were perfectly coordinated. Dr. Ashworth nodded sympathetically while explaining that persecution delusions were common in early-stage dementia and stress-related cognitive decline. Janet expressed heartbreak that I could believe my loving family capable of harming me. Derek appeared genuinely hurt by my accusations, asking how I could think such terrible things about people who'd devoted themselves to caring for me. The gaslighting was so effective that I began to question my own perceptions even while intellectually understanding what they were doing. 3 articulate adults were calmly explaining that my version of reality was wrong, that my memories were unreliable, and that my judgment was impaired. The doubt they planted was terrifying because it echoed my own fears about losing my mental capacity as my mother had before her death. Frank's phone call that afternoon confirmed that Janet's preemptive campaign had been successful. He'd been contacted by Dr. Ashworth about my evaluation, and Janet's concerns about my refusal to accept necessary medical care. From Frank's perspective, multiple professionals and family members were agreeing that I needed help, while I was the only person claiming everything was normal. His genuine love and concern made him an unwitting ally in their conspiracy to destroy my autonomy. Dr. Ashworth left behind pamphlets about assisted living facilities and legal guides for families dealing with cognitive decline, materials that would be discovered later as evidence of my family's appropriate concern and my unreasonable resistance to help. He scheduled a follow-up appointment for the next week, an appointment that would probably coincide with legal proceedings to force psychiatric evaluation if I continued to resist their intervention. That evening, I overheard Derek and Janet discussing timeline acceleration through my partially open bedroom window as they talked in my driveway. Their conversation revealed that Dr. Ashworth had provided them with the professional documentation needed to proceed with emergency conservatorship proceedings. Janet mentioned that my refusal to cooperate had actually strengthened their position by demonstrating my inability to make rational decisions about my own welfare. The most devastating betrayal came when I realized that Derek wasn't fully conscious of the murder plot he was facilitating. His genuine emotional distress during our confrontations suggested that he truly believed I was mentally ill and needed intervention. Janet had manipulated him so completely that he was participating in my destruction while thinking he was saving my life. His love for me had been weaponized against both of us, making him simultaneously a victim and perpetrator of the conspiracy. I understood that the next phase would involve forced psychiatric evaluation, probably initiated through emergency court proceedings that I would have little opportunity to contest. Once I was involuntarily committed, even temporarily, the documentation of my mental illness would be official and nearly impossible to challenge. Maria Rodriguez's death had proven they were willing to kill to achieve their goals, and my continued resistance would only accelerate their timeline for eliminating me permanently. Desperation drove me to take action that I should have taken weeks earlier. The next morning, I called Harold Patterson, my attorney for over 15 years, and scheduled an emergency appointment under the pretense of updating my will. Harold had handled my mother's estate, Richard's probate, and numerous real estate transactions over the years. If anyone could help me navigate this nightmare, it would be someone who understood both my legal situation and my mental competency from years of professional interaction. Harold's downtown office had always felt like a sanctuary of rationality and legal protection, but that afternoon it felt like my last hope for survival. When I arrived for our appointment, Harold's expression told me he'd already been contacted about my supposed mental health crisis. His greeting was professionally cordial but tinged with the careful tone people use when they're not sure if they're speaking to someone who's completely rational. The conversation that followed was both terrifying and validating. Harold explained that Janet had indeed contacted his office several weeks earlier, inquiring about conservatorship proceedings and expressing concern about my mental state. She'd described my recent, erratic behavior, including financial decisions that seemed impulsive and interactions that suggested declining judgment. Harold had refused to assist with any proceedings against me, citing our long professional relationship and his obligation to represent my interests rather than my family's concerns. When I presented Harold with the evidence I'd gathered, including photographs of the brake tampering, the GPS tracker, and recordings of my conversations with Dr. Ashworth and Derek, his professional skepticism transformed into genuine alarm. Harold had been practicing elder law for over 25 years and recognized the sophisticated nature of the conspiracy I was describing. The coordination between financial surveillance, psychological manipulation, and legal maneuvering indicated a level of planning that went far beyond simple family disagreement. Harold's most important warning concerned the timeline we were working with. Janet's inquiry about conservatorship proceedings had included questions about emergency petitions and expedited hearings, suggesting that legal action was imminent. If they filed for emergency guardianship based on Dr. Ashworth's evaluation and Derek's testimony about my paranoid delusions, I could be involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation within 72 hours. Once that happened, challenging the conservatorship would become exponentially more difficult. The introduction to Miles Sherman changed everything about my situation. Miles was Harold's former partner's private investigator, a retired police detective who specialized in financial crimes and family exploitation cases. Harold had worked with Miles on several elder abuse cases over the years and trusted his discretion and investigative skills. More importantly, Miles understood that financial exploitation of elderly family members was often a precursor to more serious crimes, including murder disguised as accidents or natural death. Miles's preliminary investigation began immediately with a background check on Janet that revealed information Derek and I had never known. Janet's recent move to Portland hadn't been motivated by a desire to be closer to family but by financial desperation. She owed over $200,000 in gambling debts to various casinos in Nevada and California, with creditors threatening legal action and possible criminal charges for unpaid markers. Her house in Sacramento was in foreclosure, and she'd declared bankruptcy twice in the past decade. Derek's financial situation was even worse than I'd realized. His garage faced not just 3 lawsuits but potential criminal charges for automotive fraud related to unnecessary repairs and parts inflation. The state licensing board was reviewing his certification, and closure seemed inevitable within the next month. Most importantly, Derek had recently taken out a substantial life insurance policy on me, listing himself as the sole beneficiary and citing family medical history as justification for the coverage. The life insurance policy was the smoking gun that proved premeditation. Miles explained that Derek couldn't have obtained such a policy without my knowledge unless I'd been drugged or otherwise incapacitated during the application process. The medical examination that accompanied the application had supposedly been conducted at my home, but I had no memory of any such visit. This meant they'd been planning my death for months, using forged signatures and possibly hiring someone to impersonate a medical examiner. Miles also uncovered evidence that Dr. Ashworth wasn't the legitimate psychiatrist he claimed to be. His license had been suspended in California for inappropriate relationships with patients, and he'd been operating in Oregon without proper certification. Janet had probably hired him to provide professional credibility for their incompetency claims, knowing that his fake credentials would give weight to his evaluation of my mental state. This discovery meant that any legal proceedings based on his assessment could be challenged and dismissed. The investigation into Maria Rodriguez's accident revealed disturbing parallels to other suspicious deaths in the area. Miles found 3 cases within the past 2 years where elderly individuals had died in single car accidents caused by brake failures, all on isolated highway stretches during times when they were driving alone. In each case, the victim had been involved in estate disputes or had family members with significant financial problems. The accidents had been ruled mechanical failures, but the pattern suggested systematic targeting of vulnerable individuals. Harold and Miles developed a comprehensive strategy for protecting me and gathering evidence of the conspiracy. The first priority was ensuring my physical safety by varying my routine and avoiding predictable travel patterns. Harold would prepare legal documents challenging any conservatorship petition and establishing my mental competency through independent medical evaluation. Miles would continue investigating the financial aspects of the plot and gathering evidence of criminal activity. The most crucial element of our strategy involved turning Derek's genuine love for me into an asset rather than a liability. Miles believed that Derek's emotional breakdown during our confrontations indicated he was being manipulated rather than acting from pure greed. If we could present him with undeniable evidence of Janet's true intentions, including the plan to kill me after the conservatorship was established, Derek might be willing to testify against Janet to protect me. Our investigation revealed that Stephanie's involvement was more extensive than simple spying. She'd been systematically documenting my daily activities, mood changes, and social interactions as part of a detailed dossier that supported claims of mental decline. Her reports included fabricated incidents and exaggerated descriptions of normal behavior, creating a fictional narrative of progressive dementia that would be presented to courts and medical professionals as factual evidence. Harold arranged for an independent psychiatric evaluation with Dr. Margaret Foster, a respected specialist in geriatric mental health who had no connection to Janet or Dr. Ashworth. The evaluation would establish my mental competency through comprehensive testing and provide expert testimony to counter any claims of cognitive impairment. Dr. Foster's preliminary assessment, based on our initial conversation, was that I showed no signs of dementia or significant cognitive decline. Miles's most disturbing discovery concerned the sophistication of their financial tracking. They'd been monitoring not just my bank accounts but my credit reports, investment accounts, and property records through identity theft and unauthorized access to financial databases. Janet had been building a complete picture of my assets to ensure that no significant holdings would be overlooked when they gained control of my estate. The timeline for their next move was accelerating rapidly. Miles learned through his law enforcement contacts that Janet had scheduled a meeting with a family court judge for the following week, probably to file emergency conservatorship papers. Dr. Ashworth's evaluation report was already being prepared, despite the fact that he'd conducted only an informal assessment in my living room. The legal machinery was in motion to strip away my autonomy and set up my eventual murder. Our counter-strategy had to be implemented immediately, before Janet could file legal papers that would trigger emergency proceedings. Harold would file a preemptive lawsuit challenging any conservatorship attempt and seeking restraining orders against further harassment. Miles would present his evidence to the district attorney's office, seeking criminal charges for fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Most importantly, we would confront Derek with evidence of Janet's true intentions and give him the opportunity to choose between his mother's life and his aunt's greed. The next 72 hours would determine whether I would retain my freedom and possibly my life, or become another victim of a sophisticated family conspiracy designed to steal everything I'd worked for and eliminate me when I was no longer useful to them. Janet's response to my resistance was swift and devastating. Within 48 hours of my meeting with Harold Patterson, she orchestrated what she would later claim was a family intervention but was actually an elaborate setup designed to provide multiple witnesses to my supposed mental breakdown. The dinner invitation seemed innocent enough, a casual family gathering to celebrate Derek's birthday, with just close family members and a few friends to keep things comfortable and low-key. I should have recognized the trap when I arrived at Derek's house to find an unexpectedly large group assembled for what was supposed to be a small birthday dinner. Frank had flown in from Seattle, supposedly as a surprise for Derek, but his presence meant Janet now had my brother as a witness to whatever she was planning. Mrs. Thompson, my former neighbor who'd moved to assisted living, was there with her daughter Carol, ostensibly because Derek had helped them with car repairs. Most suspicious was the presence of Amanda Walsh, Derek's new girlfriend, whom I'd never met but who seemed unusually interested in observing my behavior. The dinner conversation was carefully orchestrated to highlight topics that would provide opportunities for me to appear confused or paranoid. Janet steered discussions toward family history, encouraging me to share memories about Richard and my mother while subtly correcting details I mentioned. When I described events that didn't match her version, she'd exchange concerned glances with other guests and gently suggest that grief might be affecting my recollection of important moments. Derek's behavior throughout the evening was increasingly strange. He seemed nervous and distracted, checking his phone frequently and avoiding direct conversation with me. Several times I caught him watching me with an expression that seemed to be waiting for something specific to happen. When I complimented the wine he'd served, Derek became visibly agitated, insisting that I shouldn't drink too much because alcohol could interact poorly with stress medications I wasn't taking. The turning point came approximately an hour after dinner when I began to feel disoriented and paranoid in ways that were completely unlike my normal personality. Colors seemed oversaturated, sounds became distorted, and I started to believe that the dinner guests were talking about me in coded language. My suspicions about the family conspiracy suddenly seemed overwhelmingly urgent and frightening, compelling me to confront everyone present about their involvement in the plot against me. What followed was exactly what Janet had orchestrated: a public display of apparent paranoid delusions in front of multiple witnesses who had no context for understanding what was really happening. I accused Janet of drugging my wine, claimed that Derek had sabotaged my car, and insisted that everyone present was part of a conspiracy to steal my inheritance and have me killed. To the assembled guests, I appeared to be having a severe psychological episode characterized by unfounded accusations against family members who were obviously concerned about my welfare. Frank's reaction was particularly devastating because his genuine love and concern made his response seem authoritative to the other witnesses. He'd never seen me behave irrationally before, so my accusations and agitation appeared to be dramatic evidence of mental illness. When I showed him the GPS tracker I'd hidden in my purse as proof of surveillance, his inability to understand its significance made my claims seem even more delusional to everyone watching. Derek recorded portions of my breakdown on his phone, creating video evidence that would later be presented as documentation of my declining mental state. The recording showed me making wild accusations, speaking rapidly and incoherently, and displaying paranoid behavior that seemed completely unprovoked. Without context about the drugging or the legitimate conspiracy I was exposing, the video portrayed me as someone who was clearly mentally ill and potentially dangerous. Amanda's role became clear when I realized she was taking detailed notes throughout my breakdown, documenting specific statements and behaviors that could be used as evidence in legal proceedings. Her questions seemed designed to elicit responses that would support claims of paranoid delusions and cognitive impairment. Later investigation revealed that Amanda was actually a paralegal working for the attorney Janet had consulted about conservatorship proceedings. Mrs. Thompson's presence served a specific purpose. She'd recently been declared incompetent due to dementia and placed under court-ordered guardianship. Her daughter Carol could testify about the warning signs of cognitive decline and the necessity of family intervention when elderly individuals refused to accept help. My behavior at the dinner would be compared to Mrs. Thompson's early symptoms, establishing a pattern that supported immediate protective action. The most chilling aspect of the evening was how effectively the drug Janet had given me amplified my legitimate fears into apparent paranoid delusions. The hallucinogen she'd used was probably LSD or a similar substance that distorted my perception without completely incapacitating me. My real knowledge about their conspiracy became indistinguishable from drug-induced paranoia, discrediting my accurate observations while providing evidence of mental illness. Frank's genuine distress about my condition made him an unwitting ally in Janet's plan. His immediate suggestion that I needed professional help seemed reasonable to everyone present, especially after witnessing my agitated state and hearing my accusations against family members. When I refused to consider voluntary psychiatric evaluation, Frank's support for involuntary commitment appeared to be a loving brother's necessary intervention to save his sister's life. The aftermath of the dinner party was swift and decisive. Janet filed for emergency conservatorship the next morning, using witness statements from the dinner guests and Derek's video recording as evidence that I posed an immediate danger to myself and others. Dr. Ashworth provided a supplementary report based on his earlier assessment, recommending immediate psychiatric hospitalization for comprehensive evaluation and stabilization. The legal papers were served 48 hours later, on a Friday afternoon when most court offices were closing and my ability to respond would be limited by weekend scheduling. The emergency conservatorship hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, giving me less than 3 days to prepare a defense against claims supported by multiple witnesses and professional medical opinion. Harold Patterson's reaction to the conservatorship petition was both professional outrage and personal alarm. The speed of the legal proceedings and the coordination between multiple witnesses indicated a level of preparation that went far beyond spontaneous family concern. Janet had been planning this attack for weeks, timing the dinner party to coincide with court schedules that would minimize my ability to mount an effective defense. Miles Sherman's investigation into the drug used at the dinner party provided crucial evidence of premeditation. Toxicology analysis of my blood, drawn within 12 hours of the incident, revealed the presence of lysergic acid diethylamide, a hallucinogen that would have produced exactly the symptoms I'd displayed. The drug required advanced planning to obtain and sophisticated knowledge of dosage and timing to administer effectively. The discovery that Amanda was a paralegal working for Janet's attorney constituted fraud and conspiracy charges that could invalidate the entire conservatorship proceeding. Her presence at the dinner party under false pretenses, combined with her documentation of my drugged behavior, represented evidence tampering that could result in criminal charges against everyone involved in the conspiracy. Derek's emotional state after the dinner party suggested that he was beginning to understand the true nature of Janet's plan. His video recording of my breakdown had been motivated by Janet's instructions rather than his own judgment, and his obvious distress while filming indicated some awareness that he was participating in my destruction. Miles believed that Derek could be convinced to testify truthfully if confronted with evidence of Janet's intent to kill me after gaining legal control of my assets. The most terrifying aspect of the situation was how close Janet had come to complete success. If I hadn't discovered the brake tampering and tracking device, her plan would have proceeded without significant obstacles. The dinner party had provided multiple credible witnesses to my apparent mental illness, professional medical documentation supported her claims, and legal proceedings were already in motion to strip away my autonomy. Within a week, I could be involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility while Janet gained control over my estate and planned my eventual murder. The emergency conservatorship hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. Monday morning, giving Harold Patterson and me exactly 56 hours to prepare a defense against what amounted to a perfectly orchestrated legal ambush. The petition Janet had filed was supported by witness statements from 6 individuals, video evidence of my apparent breakdown, and professional psychiatric evaluation recommending immediate intervention. On paper, their case appeared overwhelming, while my claims of a family conspiracy to murder me for my inheritance sounded exactly like the paranoid delusions of someone experiencing severe mental illness. Harold's emergency motion for continuance was denied by Judge Patricia Williams, who noted that the petitioners had demonstrated immediate risk to my safety and welfare. The court's primary concern was protecting me from potential self-harm or financial exploitation that could result from impaired judgment. Janet's attorney had brilliantly framed the situation as a race against time to save me from my own deteriorating mental state, making any delay seem like dangerous negligence. The 48 hours before the hearing became a nightmare of isolation and surveillance. Derek and Janet had convinced Frank that I shouldn't be left alone, citing Dr. Ashworth's recommendation for constant supervision until professional care could be arranged. Frank genuinely believed he was protecting me, but his presence in my home meant I couldn't speak freely with Harold or Miles without revealing our investigation to someone who would inevitably report our activities to Janet. Derek's behavior during this period revealed the internal conflict that was tearing him apart. He would arrive at my house looking haggard and guilty, clearly struggling with knowledge that was destroying his peace of mind. Several times I caught him staring at me with expressions of anguish that suggested he was beginning to understand the true implications of Janet's plan. But whenever I tried to speak with him privately, Janet would appear within minutes, as if she was monitoring our communications and preventing any conversation that might expose her manipulation. The most devastating blow came when I discovered they'd changed the locks on my mother's Victorian mansion while I was attending the conservatorship consultation. Janet presented forged documents claiming I'd given permission for the security upgrade during my confused episode at Derek's dinner party. The locksmith's receipt showed that Janet had provided identification and signed paperwork as my legal representative, despite having no such authority. My childhood home, filled with irreplaceable memories and worth almost $3 million, was now effectively under Janet's control. Harold's investigation of the legal proceedings revealed how thoroughly Janet had prepared her case. She'd consulted with 3 different attorneys before selecting one who specialized in expedited conservatorship proceedings for mentally incapacitated individuals. Dr. Ashworth's evaluation report contained detailed psychiatric terminology and referenced standard diagnostic criteria for dementia and paranoid disorders. The witness statements from the dinner party were professionally written and legally precise, describing specific behaviors that met criteria for involuntary commitment. Miles Sherman's race to gather counter-evidence was hampered by the abbreviated timeline and Janet's anticipation of our likely defense strategies. The GPS tracker had been removed from my car and was nowhere to be found, eliminating our most concrete proof of surveillance. Derek had already repaired the brake tampering, erasing evidence of sabotage. Dr. Ashworth had disappeared, probably leaving the state to avoid questions about his suspended medical license and fraudulent credentials. The most crushing realization was how few allies I actually had when the crisis reached its peak. My neighbors had been contacted by Janet about my mental health concerns, poisoning them against me with claims that I'd been making paranoid accusations and behaving erratically. My real estate colleagues had heard rumors about my cognitive decline and were avoiding professional contact that might involve them in family drama. Even my longtime housekeeper, Maria Santos, had been convinced that I was experiencing memory problems and needed supervision. Frank's unwavering support for Janet's intervention plan felt like the ultimate betrayal, even though I knew his motivations were loving rather than malicious. He'd been presented with witness testimony, professional medical opinion, and video evidence that his sister was mentally ill and refusing necessary treatment. From his perspective, opposing the conservatorship would be abandoning me to suffer alone rather than ensuring I received the care I obviously needed. The night before the hearing, I experienced genuine moments of doubt about my own mental state. The sophisticated nature of the psychological manipulation made me question whether I was actually losing my mind and creating paranoid fantasies to explain normal family concern. The evidence of conspiracy seemed overwhelming when I reviewed it privately, but presenting it to skeptical strangers in a courtroom setting would make me sound exactly like the delusional woman Janet was claiming I'd become. Dr. Margaret Foster's independent psychiatric evaluation provided the first ray of hope in what seemed like an impossible situation. Her comprehensive testing revealed no signs of cognitive impairment, dementia, or psychiatric illness that would justify involuntary commitment or conservatorship. Dr. Foster's report specifically addressed the claims made by Dr. Ashworth, noting that his evaluation methodology was unprofessional and his conclusions unsupported by proper diagnostic procedures. Miles Sherman's breakthrough discovery that Amanda Walsh was a paralegal working for Janet's attorney constituted fraud that could invalidate the entire conservatorship proceeding. Amanda's presence at the dinner party under false pretenses meant that my behavior had been documented by someone with legal training specifically to build a case against me. The coordination between Amanda's note-taking and Derek's video recording showed premeditation that went far beyond spontaneous family concern. The most important development came when Miles confronted Derek with evidence of Janet's gambling debts and her plan to kill me after gaining control of my estate. Derek's emotional breakdown when faced with the truth about Janet's intentions provided Miles with a potential witness who could testify about the conspiracy from inside the family circle. Derek's genuine love for me, despite his financial desperation, made him recoil in horror from the idea that he'd been manipulated into facilitating my murder. Harold's legal strategy focused on exposing the premeditation and coordination that proved the conservatorship petition was part of a criminal conspiracy rather than legitimate family concern. The timing of events, the presence of undisclosed legal professionals at the dinner party, and the sophisticated nature of the psychological manipulation indicated planning that contradicted claims of spontaneous intervention to help a family member in crisis. The discovery of Derek's life insurance policy on me provided the final piece of evidence that proved murderous intent. Miles learned that the policy had been purchased 3 months earlier, during the same period when Janet was researching conservatorship laws and Derek was beginning surveillance of my activities. The combination of legal control over my estate and financial benefit from my death created a clear motive for the conspiracy. As Monday morning approached, I realized that the conservatorship hearing would determine not just my immediate freedom but potentially my survival. If Janet succeeded in having me declared incompetent, she would gain control over my assets while I was warehoused in a psychiatric facility. Once the legal arrangements were complete, my accidental death would transfer everything to Derek, with Janet receiving her predetermined share for orchestrating the entire scheme. The most terrifying aspect of facing the hearing was knowing that Janet's plan was both sophisticated enough to succeed and evil enough to include my murder as a necessary final step. She'd already proven her willingness to kill by causing Maria Rodriguez's death, and my continued resistance had made my elimination seem urgent rather than optional. If the court ruled against me, I would probably be dead within months, another victim of family greed disguised as mental health intervention. The conservatorship hearing began at 9 a.m. sharp in Judge Patricia Williams's courtroom, with Janet's attorney presenting a case that appeared devastating in its thoroughness and professional credibility. Margaret Crawford was a seasoned lawyer who specialized in protecting vulnerable elderly adults from their own declining mental faculties, and she genuinely believed she was advocating for someone who needed immediate professional care and family support. Crawford's opening statement painted me as a once capable woman whose grief over her husband's death had triggered progressive mental decline that was endangering both my physical safety and financial security. She presented the dinner party incident as a culmination of months of deteriorating behavior witnessed by multiple family members who were now seeking court intervention as a last resort to save me from my own impaired judgment. The witness testimony was carefully orchestrated to build a compelling narrative of mental illness and family devotion. Frank testified tearfully about his shock at seeing his previously rational sister making wild accusations against family members who'd devoted themselves to her care. Mrs. Thompson's daughter described the similarities between my behavior and her mother's early dementia symptoms. Derek's girlfriend Amanda provided detailed observations about my apparent paranoia and disorientation during what she believed was a normal family dinner. Derek's testimony was the most damaging because his obvious emotional pain made his account seem credible and heartbreaking. He described finding me in the garage making paranoid claims about brake tampering and surveillance devices, his genuine concern for my mental state evident in every word. The video recording of my breakdown at the dinner party was played for the court, showing me making accusations that sounded delusional without context about the drugging or legitimate conspiracy. Dr. Ashworth's written evaluation was presented as expert testimony, despite his absence from the hearing. His professional credentials appeared legitimate in the court documents, and his detailed psychiatric assessment concluded that I was experiencing paranoid delusions and cognitive impairment that posed immediate risks to my safety and welfare. His recommendation for involuntary psychiatric commitment carried the weight of medical expertise that would be difficult to challenge. Harold Patterson's cross-examination of the witnesses began to expose inconsistencies in their accounts and timeline irregularities that suggested coordination rather than spontaneous concern. He focused on the suspicious timing of events, the presence of unknown individuals at the dinner party, and the remarkable speed with which legal proceedings had been initiated after my alleged breakdown. When Harold called Derek for additional questioning, the pressure of lying under oath while facing evidence of the murder plot finally broke his resolve. Confronted with documentation of Janet's gambling debts, the life insurance policy he'd purchased on my life, and Miles Sherman's evidence of Maria Rodriguez's death, Derek collapsed emotionally and confessed to the court that he'd been manipulated into believing I was mentally ill when I was actually uncovering a conspiracy to steal my inheritance. Derek's courtroom breakdown was devastating to Janet's case but provided the breakthrough Harold needed to expose the truth. Under Harold's questioning, Derek admitted to installing the GPS tracker, tampering with my brakes, and participating in the dinner party setup that was designed to discredit my mental competency. His testimony revealed that Janet had convinced him I was suicidal and planning dangerous solo trips, making surveillance seem like necessary protection rather than criminal stalking. The most dramatic moment came when Derek testified about Janet's reaction to Maria Rodriguez's death. Instead of showing remorse about the innocent woman who died in my place, Janet had been frustrated that their plan had failed and immediately began discussing alternative methods for causing my accidental death. Derek's realization that Janet was planning to kill me rather than simply control my finances had triggered his emotional crisis and ultimate confession. Margaret Crawford's case collapsed completely when Harold presented evidence that Dr. Ashworth's medical license had been suspended and Amanda Walsh was actually a paralegal working for Crawford's law firm. The revelation that legal professionals had participated in documenting my drugged behavior under false pretenses constituted fraud that invalidated the entire conservatorship petition. Judge Williams's reaction to the evidence of criminal conspiracy was swift and decisive. She dismissed the conservatorship petition immediately and ordered law enforcement to arrest Janet for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Derek was arrested for his role in the surveillance and brake tampering, though his cooperation and obvious manipulation by Janet would later result in reduced charges. Janet's arrest in the courthouse was dramatic and desperate. Realizing that Derek's testimony had exposed the murder plot, she attempted to flee the building but was apprehended by court security before reaching the parking garage. Her immediate demand for an attorney and refusal to answer questions suggested preparation for this possibility, but the overwhelming evidence against her made defense unlikely to succeed. Stephanie's involvement was exposed during the police investigation that followed the hearing. Her detailed surveillance reports about my daily activities were discovered during the search of Derek's home, revealing the extent of the monitoring operation that had been tracking my movements for months. Her cooperation with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges provided additional evidence about the planning and coordination involved in the conspiracy. Miles Sherman's investigation had uncovered the black market drug dealer who'd provided the hallucinogen used to drug me at the dinner party. The dealer's records showed that Janet had purchased enough LSD to drug me multiple times, suggesting that the dinner party incident wasn't her first attempt to make me appear mentally ill. Previous incidents where I'd felt disoriented or confused were probably earlier drugging attempts designed to establish a pattern of cognitive decline. The most shocking revelation came when police investigated Maria Rodriguez's accident scene with knowledge that it had been sabotage rather than mechanical failure. Additional evidence of brake line tampering was discovered, confirming that her death had been murder intended for me. Janet's cell phone records showed that she'd been in contact with Derek immediately before and after the accident, coordinating their response to what they believed was my successful elimination. Harold's legal victory in the conservatorship hearing was complete, but the personal cost of the conspiracy's exposure was devastating for everyone involved. Derek's genuine remorse about his participation couldn't undo the damage he'd caused or bring back Maria Rodriguez. Frank's shock at learning how completely he'd been manipulated left him questioning his judgment about family relationships and his ability to protect the people he loved. The court's final ruling included restraining orders preventing Janet or any of her associates from contacting me, accessing my property, or attempting to influence my financial or medical decisions. Judge Williams noted that the sophisticated nature of the conspiracy and the evidence of murderous intent made continued protection necessary even after criminal charges were filed. As law enforcement led Janet away in handcuffs, her final words were a threat that she would find ways to complete what she'd started, even from prison. The hatred in her voice when she looked at me confirmed that her motivation had gone beyond simple greed to personal animosity that wouldn't be resolved by legal proceedings. Miles Sherman warned me that Janet's gambling debts were owed to people who wouldn't hesitate to use violence for collection, meaning that my safety might remain at risk even after her imprisonment. 3 months after the conservatorship hearing that saved my life and exposed the conspiracy that nearly destroyed me, I was finally able to begin the healing process that had been interrupted by my family's betrayal. Derek's sentencing to 15 years in prison for attempted murder and conspiracy reflected both the seriousness of his crimes and the court's recognition that he'd been manipulated by someone he trusted. His tearful apology during the sentencing hearing couldn't undo the damage he'd caused, but his cooperation with prosecutors had been essential in securing Janet's conviction and preventing her from claiming that the conspiracy was Derek's idea rather than her own. Janet received 12 years for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder, a sentence that seemed inadequate given the sophisticated nature of her planning and her willingness to kill innocent people like Maria Rodriguez to achieve her goals. Her gambling debts had been transferred to collection agencies that were now pursuing civil judgments against her, meaning that even after her release from prison, she would face financial ruin and potential danger from creditors who'd lost money during her incarceration. Stephanie's 5 years of probation for her cooperation with prosecutors reflected the court's recognition that her involvement had been significant but not murderous. Her detailed surveillance reports had been crucial in building the case against me, but her willingness to testify about Janet's manipulation and Derek's genuine belief in my mental illness helped establish the sophisticated nature of the psychological warfare that had nearly succeeded in destroying my life. The psychological evaluation I underwent after the legal proceedings confirmed what Harold Patterson and Miles Sherman had suspected from the beginning. I was completely mentally competent, with no signs of cognitive decline or psychiatric illness that would have justified conservatorship or involuntary commitment. Dr. Foster's comprehensive report noted that my ability to recognize and document the conspiracy against me demonstrated sophisticated reasoning and memory function that was inconsistent with any form of dementia or mental illness. Regaining control of my finances revealed the extent of the damage that had been done during the months when Derek had access to my accounts and Janet was monitoring my assets. Beyond the unauthorized withdrawals and transfers that totaled nearly $8,000, they'd attempted to refinance my mother's Victorian mansion using forged documents and had contacted my investment advisor about liquidating retirement accounts under the pretense of consolidating my holdings for easier management. The most difficult aspect of recovery was learning to trust my own judgment again after months of psychological manipulation designed to make me doubt my perceptions and memory. Janet's gaslighting had been so sophisticated that even after the conspiracy was exposed, I sometimes wondered if my recollections of events were accurate or if grief and stress had distorted my understanding of what had actually happened. Working with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery from family abuse, helped me understand the techniques that had been used to undermine my confidence and isolate me from potential sources of help. The combination of drugging, surveillance, document theft, and coordinated lying had created an environment where questioning my own sanity seemed more reasonable than believing that my family was systematically destroying my life for financial gain. The friendship that developed with Miles Sherman during the investigation became one of the most positive outcomes of surviving the conspiracy. His understanding of criminal psychology and experience with family exploitation cases helped me recognize that Janet's behavior followed predictable patterns that had nothing to do with my actions or character. Miles's continued friendship and his willingness to discuss the case honestly helped me process the trauma without feeling like I was burdening people who couldn't understand the complexity of what I'd experienced. Harold Patterson's legal expertise had obviously been crucial in defeating the conservatorship petition, but his personal support during the investigation and recovery process demonstrated the value of professional relationships that extend beyond simple business transactions. Harold's 20-year knowledge of my mental competency and financial responsibility provided credibility that countered the manufactured evidence of decline that Janet and Derek had presented to the court. The establishment of the Matthews Foundation for Elder Protection became my way of transforming the trauma I'd experienced into help for other people facing similar exploitation. The foundation provides legal assistance, investigative services, and psychological support for elderly individuals who are being financially or psychologically abused by family members or caregivers who claim to be acting in their best interests. Working with other elder abuse survivors through the foundation helped me understand that my experience, while traumatic and nearly fatal, was part of a larger pattern of exploitation that targets vulnerable individuals whose assets make them appealing to predators within their own families. The stories shared by foundation clients revealed tactics similar to those Janet had used, including isolation, gaslighting, surveillance, and legal manipulation designed to strip away autonomy and transfer wealth to abusers. The most profound lesson from surviving my family's betrayal was understanding that love and evil can coexist within the same relationship, making family abuse particularly devastating because it violates the most basic assumptions about safety and trust. Derek's genuine love for me had been real, but it hadn't prevented him from participating in a conspiracy that could have killed me when his financial desperation collided with Janet's manipulation. Learning to drive again on the highway where Maria Rodriguez had died was one of the most difficult challenges of my recovery process. The guilt I felt about her death, even though I'd been the intended victim, required months of therapy and the support of her family, who understood that their mother had died because of someone else's greed rather than any action I'd taken. The memorial scholarship I established in Maria's name provides college funding for students studying automotive safety, ensuring that her death contributes to preventing similar tragedies. The process of rebuilding relationships with family members who'd been deceived by Janet's manipulation, particularly Frank, required patience and understanding that their actions had been motivated by genuine concern rather than malicious intent. Frank's guilt about supporting the conservatorship petition was as painful for him as his betrayal had been for me, but our relationship ultimately grew stronger through honest discussion about how sophisticated manipulation can deceive even the most loving and well-intentioned people. 6 months after the conspiracy was exposed, I was able to return to my mother's Victorian mansion and begin the restoration process that would eliminate the physical reminders of Janet's invasion of my privacy and safety. Changing every lock, replacing security systems, and repainting rooms that had been contaminated by her presence became a therapeutic process of reclaiming space that had been violated by someone I'd trusted. The most important realization from surviving this experience was understanding that strength isn't about avoiding betrayal or preventing people from hurting us, but about recognizing abuse when it occurs and taking action to protect ourselves even when doing so means challenging people we love. The instincts that led me to investigate Derek's brake inspection and document the evidence I discovered had saved my life, but only because I'd been willing to trust my perceptions despite coordinated efforts to convince me that my judgment was impaired. Today, as I drive down the same highway where Maria Rodriguez died and where I was supposed to have my fatal accident, I'm grateful for the second chance that her death inadvertently provided me. The conspiracy that was designed to destroy my life ultimately revealed the difference between people who loved me and people who saw me as a source of wealth to be exploited. The betrayal was devastating, but surviving it taught me that recovery from family abuse is possible when we're willing to seek help from people outside the circle of manipulation and trust our own perceptions even when doing so feels dangerous. The Foundation's work with elder abuse survivors has shown me that family betrayal, while traumatic, doesn't have to define the rest of our lives. Every person who finds the courage to report exploitation and seek help makes it easier for others to recognize that they're not alone in facing these challenges. Sometimes the people who should protect us are the ones we need protection from, but acknowledging that reality is the first step toward building genuine safety and finding people worthy of our trust. If you've made it through this entire story, I want to hear your thoughts about family dynamics and the warning signs that might help others recognize exploitation before it becomes dangerous. Have you ever experienced manipulation from people close to you, or do you know someone who might benefit from hearing about resources for elder protection? Please share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to support more stories about survival and recovery. Share this story with anyone who might need to hear that it's possible to survive family betrayal and build a stronger life afterward. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that trusting your instincts about dangerous relationships isn't paranoia, it's survival. Stay safe, stay strong, and never let anyone convince you that asking for help makes you weak.